In this video, we will look at the different types of errors that you might run in running your application in Java. We can divide these errors in Java into three different types. The first one is called syntax errors. And these errors happen because you are not following the rules of the programming language that you are using, in our case, Java. So if you are not writing the commands correctly, you are misspelling these classes, you are misspelling the method names or any of these other keywords that you have in your program, that will cause a syntax error. And these syntax errors are caught by the compiler. So your program will not be able to compile until you fix these syntax errors. And if you are using an IDE like Eclipse, usually Eclipse will highlight these errors and underline them to tell you to fix them before you are able to compile these programs. The second type of errors are runtime errors, and these are not caught by the compiler. These happen while your program is running and you are performing an illegal operation during the execution of your program. And these are done or happen in Java virtual machine. So your program will find or will run an illegal operation, and that will cause your program not to be able to continue executing, and that will terminate your program. The third type of error is not detected by Java, which is a logical error. So this happens because you are not producing the expected output that you want from your program. So you, instead of, for example, multiplying numbers, you are dividing them. So this is not performing the correct operation and you are not producing the correct result expected from that program. So let's look at some examples of syntax errors here in Java. So let's say I want to print hello world. So system.out.println, and then I will say hello world. So I'm printing hello world in here, and notice I have this red line in here because I use println, and println is not a method in the system.out class. So you'll see that println is highlighted and we have an error. So if I try to run my program now, you'll see it will tell me that errors exist in the required project. If I try to launch, proceed, it will say that we have an exception here where we have a syntax error. We have a syntax error, and another syntax error we missed here is also the semicolon. Remember, each command or each line in your code has to terminate with a semicolon. So this is what we called a syntax error, where you are not following the rules of the programming language. And in this case, we are using Java, so we are not following the rules of Java, where every command is terminated by a semicolon. We have to make sure that we are spelling these methods and classes correctly, and we are not using them incorrectly in here. So again, syntax errors happen because you are not following the rules of Java. Logic errors happen because you are not producing the correct output according to the program requirement. And what we are interested in here are runtime errors. These runtime errors happen at the execution time. So the compiler will allow you to compile, you'll be able to execute the program, but during the execution you are doing an illegal operation that will cause your program to terminate, and that's what we need to fix. Now these runtime errors, we can classify them into two different types. The first type is called system errors. And system errors are happening because of an internal system error. So it's not something that you did wrong, it's not an operation that you are performing illegally in your program. These happen because of an internal system error. And these rarely happen. They do not happen that often, and there's nothing you can do about them other than terminating your program in an efficient or a graceful way. The one that we are interested in, or the type that we are interested in, are the exceptions. The exceptions happen because you are performing an illegal operation in your program. And these illegal operations are happening because your program is interacting with an external resource, an external circumstance, for example, reading an input from the user or reading data from a file, and you are not performing the correct operation, or you are performing an illegal operation. So for example, you are asking the user for a number and then you divided that number by 0. So this is an illegal operation which will cause a runtime exception called arithmetic exception, which we'll look at in a bit. So what do you need to do about these exceptions? You need to handle them, you need to catch them in your program, handle them, and allow the user to continue executing the program instead of terminating this program and not allowing them to recover from that mistake. So let's start looking at the first type of these exceptions, which are runtime exceptions. Runtime exceptions happen because an illegal operation happened at runtime, and that was what generated the exception. For example, we have three types we'll look at now: the arithmetic exception, null pointer exception, and array index out of bounds exception. So let's see some of these exceptions in action. I'm going to create an integer a that has the value 0, an integer b that has the value 1, and then an integer c that has the result of dividing a by b. So a divided by b will be 0, so this should execute without a problem. We do not have a problem. I'm not printing anything out, so we do not have a problem with this program. But if we switched and tried to divide b by a, so b, which is 1 divided by 0, you'll see that we will run into an exception called an arithmetic exception, which is division by 0. So the exception, you'll see we have three parts. The first part is telling you that we have an exception and the location of that exception, or the type of that exception, java.lang.arithmetic exception. And then this is a comment about the exception, which is division by 0. And then the location of that exception where it happened. This is the package name, the class name, the method, and then the line, exactly the line that we have the exception happening at. If we click on it, you'll see that it's pointing to the location where the exception happened. Let's try another exception. Let's say we have an integer array, and we have in that array 3 elements, 1, 2, and 3. And we try to print out system.out.println the array at location 3. Now, remember, the last location in our array will be at location 2. We start with 0, 1, 2. So although we have 3 elements, the last element is not at location 3, the last element is at location 2. So if we try to access element at location 3, this element is out of the bounds of the array, and that will also cause an exception at runtime. So if we run it, you will see we have an exception, and it's called array index out of bounds exception. And this is the number we are trying, or the index that we are trying to access out of bounds, which is index 3. And this is the location where the exception happened, the package name, the class name, and the method. And then if you click here, it will show you the exact line where this exception happened. Another exception that we might run into during the execution of our program is the null pointer exception. Let's say that we are creating a string name, and we initialized it to the value null. So there is basically no string in there. We are just creating the string, and it's pointing to a null object. Now, if you try to print system.out.println or print name.char at location 0. Now the problem here, we are trying to access the first character in nothing. There's nothing in there. So this object reference is pointing to nothing or null, and we are trying to get the first character of that nothing. And that will cause me something called a null pointer exception. So you'll see we have java.lang null pointer exception, and this is happening at line 11 in here. This could happen also if you have an object of another class and you did not instantiate that object properly, and you tried to access some methods in that object. For example, you have a student class, you did not instantiate that object of the student class properly, and you tried to get the age or set the age of that student. In that case, you might get the null pointer exception. Now, since these exceptions are happening at runtime, the one that handles or deals with these exceptions is the Java virtual machine. So how does the Java virtual machine handle an exception? Let's look at the timeline that we have for exceptions. So if we are inside a method and then an exception happened, this method will create an object of the class exception. This exception object, we will send it or throw it to the Java virtual machine. The Java virtual machine will catch that exception, and it will have the description, the state of the program, and where that exception that happened in our program is located at. So as we saw before, we have the name of the exception, the type, the description of that exception, and where that exception happened. So this process, we call it throwing an exception. When we create that exception object that we send to the runtime system, That's called throwing an exception. And the Java virtual machine deals with it by terminating the program and displaying these details about that exception like we saw before. So any code that is after that exception, so any program code that you have after the line that the exception occurred at, will not be executed anymore because the program will be terminated. So let's see what happens again. I have the null object name null, and then we are trying to access the character at location 0, which we saw before through a null pointer exception. If we had any other line after this place where the exception happened, so system.out.println, let's say hi, this line will not be executed because my program, once we have an exception in here and we throw that exception to the Java virtual machine, the Java virtual machine will terminate that program. So you'll see we did not print hi, although hi is not causing a problem, but this line caused an exception, and my program will terminate at that line and it will not continue executing anything after that line. So what do we want to do? We actually want to avoid having the Java virtual machine terminate our program. If the user made a mistake, we want to allow them to fix that mistake and continue executing the program. Or if something happened outside of the user control, we do not want to display that error message that they cannot understand. We might want to display a different user-friendly error message. So what we don't want to do exactly is we want to intercept that exception object. Instead of throwing it to the Java virtual machine, we want to catch that exception and handle it and deal with it ourselves. So how do we do that? We will be using two keywords, try and catch. The try and catch, these are two blocks. We will be surrounding the code that might generate the exception. We try that code. If it throws an exception, in the catch block, we will catch that exception and handle that exception. And this is what we can call an exception handler. An exception handler is to have a try catch block that will try the code and then catch the exception. After you handle that exception, your program will continue to run. So any line of code that is after that exception generating code will continue to run and will be still performing the next operation in our program.